This podcast is a member of the Place to Be Nation family. Visit us at placetobenation.com, the only place to be in your pop culture world.
Place to Be Nation, welcome back to another edition of the movie review of the day here on the Pop Experience. I am Steve Riddle, back again for another go-around. And today I am kicking off our theme week this week. It is, if you're listening to this on the day it drops, of course, Memorial Day Monday. So happy Memorial Day to all of you. And a big thank you to our veterans of our armed forces that made the ultimate sacrifice so that we could do this podcast as well as all of our pods here at Place to Be. We are very thankful for you. And our theme week this week that we are doing is, of course, going to be all about summer blockbusters. Of course, Memorial Day weekend, kind of the unofficial kickoff to the summer season for films, and we are going to be covering films that were released during the season. And the film I'm doing for you today is widely considered by many to be kind of the first official summer blockbuster, in that it helped kick off what would be known as the summer season, because at the time, the summer was kind of seen as I don't want to say it's a dead zone, but definitely not one that many considered a time for big films to come out. But this film definitely bucked that trend, and it was definitely the launching point for its director, even though he had already done a couple of films prior to this. The film I'm doing for you today is, of course, the iconic Jaws. It was, of course, released on June 20th, 1975. Budget of $9 million. Box office $495 million. So obviously a huge, huge success. It stars Roy Scheider, Robert Shaw, Richard Dreyfuss, Lorraine Gary, my apologies. Murray Hamilton, Carl Gottlieb, Jeffrey Kramer, Susan Backlany, Lee Fierro, and Peter Benchley. It is based off the novel of the same name by Peter Benchley, who also co-wrote the screenplay, about a marine biologist, a police chief, and a shark hunter who attempt to hunt down a great white shark that is terrorizing a New England town over the 4th of July weekend. So as I normally do, I will start off with the 3 things that worked and 3 things that didn't work. So 3 things that worked. Number 1, and one ended up being a major positive to overwrite a huge negative. For those that don't know, during the filming of the movie, the shark that they were using, which was an animatronic, was not being very cooperative with them. So, Steven Spielberg, of course, the director, was definitely having some issues with it, but it actually ended up working out in its favor, because we would see the film kind of would inspire future horror films where, kind of building up the tension and building up that sense of danger without actually seeing what is in front of you. And I think that works very well in this film, in that, even though there's a shark in the water, you don't actually see the shark. You just see, we just get kind of like the shots in the water. The few times when it does attack somebody, we just see them flailing, but we don't actually see the shark. And then, when we get to the point when we go hunting and we actually finally see the shark, it just further ratchets up that tension. And coupled into that, of course, is the incredible score by the legendary John Williams, who, again, those little senses of the fear that you never know what's coming. And what I like about this as well is that the fact that this is not, it's a thriller, but it's not actually a horror film, even though I think a lot of people consider it a horror film. But it's really not. It's, there are obviously points where you're potentially getting a jump scare, but for the most part, it just all plays in this notion of, there's danger there, but because you can't see it, it just makes you puts you more on edge. And I think, Spielberg did a really good job in kind of conveying that. And like I said, it would become kind of, we would see that throughout in later years for horror films when they would use kind of that same technique. So yeah. Number 2, again, this was definitely a big launching point for Spielberg. He, we were at a time where, he and a couple of other new young directors were coming up. One of them, of course, being his close friend George Lucas, who in 2 years would, of course, release his big magnum opus, that being Star Wars. And Spielberg, even though, like I said, he had already been he had a few films prior to this. His first happened to be, was the 1964 film Firelight, and then, like I said, he had a few other ones. This is what really, this is what put him on the map, and I think he kind of showed that, that he was and he was to be a force to be reckoned with, and he, would. Again, at a time when films were not being, when big films were not being released during the summer, he definitely, I think he saw something that a lot of people didn't see, and he kind of and he would eventually set the tone for what we would see in the future, and I think he definitely deserves a lot of credit for that. At a time when, when the summer was not seen as a big launching point for films. So again, I think he definitely deserves a lot of credit for that. And number 3, the culmination of the film where, we got these 3 guys on the boat, I think the best way to describe this film is definitely a film of 2 halves. The first half, you have this, we're on this, this island, and, and we're really starting to see the tension build, because we spend the first half on this island. We do get a couple of attacks. We get, a big party. The mayor is trying to, bring about, because obviously, anyone who lives in like that New England area will know that for a lot of these towns, the summer tourism is their lifeline, and obviously you don't want to, shut it down for any reason, but at the same time, you don't want to, risk lives. But yeah, so we got that, and then of course the second half is basically the 3 guys, of course, which their name, Brody, Quint, and Hooper, who are looking for who are on the hunt for the shark, and that we see them valiantly finally take down this shark, and it's it's a great feel good story, feel good moment at the end there when they defeat the shark, and save the day. So again, I thought it was again, really well done how they kind of split this almost into 2 halves. So again, tremendous work to Steven Spielberg for that. But now we'll go ahead and talk about the 3 things that didn't work, and number 1, obviously, they mentioned it a couple of times about how this town's purportedly never dealt with shark attacks before. But, if you know that there's a shark in your area, the last thing I think you would want to do is promote a big beach celebration and then try to get people to go into the water when, not, when you know that there's still the threat of the shark out there. So I think the mayor of this island, which is Amity is the name of the island, he definitely, they could have done, I think, a little bit of a better job with that. And, it's again, it's one of those things where, you have to build up that tension. And, but again, it just makes the mayor look like a dumbass that he would, do something like this. Number 2, even though I talked about how the shark, the issues Spielberg was having with the shark, would lead to him just kind of taking this different direction and just implying that the shark was there, and building the tension. You do kind of wonder what how different the end product would have been had the shark been able to function properly, and we would actually see it attacking people in that first half, and would it have gotten it over a little bit more, or or maybe just having it be the way it was perfect for what it was. But again, it's one of those things where it's like, well, I guess we'll, maybe, we'll never really know what would happen with that. And then number 3, I think, looking back, we understand why they end up doing sequels to the films to this, but eventually, as we do see, it was come one of those opening to the return on investment would get lower with each one. I know Jaws 2 is considered kind of it's considered a fine sequel, though probably not as definitely not as good as the first one. But then of course when we get to Jaws 3D and then Jaws: The Revenge, then again it's again the returns become a lot more diminishing. So this is probably one of those ones where we just stick with the one and not go forward with that. I mean, to the point that even Spielberg himself had said that doing a sequel to anything is just a cheap carny trick, which he probably he probably, considering how many other sequels he's done to this point, he's done going forward, I think maybe he would have probably would have been better off just saying maybe it's just not for me, but if anybody else wants to do it, that's fine. Hence with the sequels to Jaws, he wasn't involved with any of them. So, again, just something for another, something there for another, just to chew on. But now we'll go ahead and talk about my my awards. My MVP of the film is definitely Roy Scheider, who plays Chief Brody, because he's pretty much the guy that's the point man for all of this, to try to protect this island and then go out and overcome his fear of water to take the shark down. And Scheider really does a great job in invoking that in Brody. And interestingly enough, the initial 3 that were suggested for the film were Robert Redford, Paul Newman, and Steve McQueen, which would have made things a lot more drastically different. But Spielberg actually wanted to avoid hiring some big stars. And I mean, your big star at this point was probably would have to have been Richard Dreyfuss, because he had already been in American Graffiti a few years prior, and I know he did some TV, but I think that was more after this. So, he had already he had been in some TV shows to this point, never in any as a major role. It would only be until afterwards where he would with that. But back to the to my original point. I think Scheider definitely was my MVP, and Brody is also my favorite character. I do want to give a little nod to Quint, played by Robert Shaw, who we really kind of see. We see him in the a little bit early on when they're talking about what to do about the shark, and he offers he offers to go hunt it down for $10,000, and then he kind of gets ignored. But then they end up going to him at the end, and we kind of it pretty much becomes a three-man film at that point with him, Brody, and Hooper, and they definitely they do work out hard, and you do kind of feel bad because Quint he talks about how he survived the sinking of the USS Indianapolis, which the sailors there were then killed by a bunch of sharks, and then he does end up not surviving it, at the very end. So it is kind of sad. And then Hooper, brings his expertise in. So the 3 of them I thought were great characters. My least favorite character is definitely the mayor, Larry Vaughn, who again, you got this shark that's terrorizing the water, terrorizing this island, and because you want to keep your business for your town afloat, you end up opening you keep the beaches open, and then at one point he's actually encouraging people to go in the water, which leads the shark to come back. So he's definitely my least favorite character. Favorite scene? I mean, there's some hard ones. I mean, obviously you got the most iconic scene, which is of course the opening where the girl decides to go skinny dipping and then ends up becoming the first victim of the shark. You got the scenes at the beach, you got this, all the chaos at the end. But I think my favorite scene, I think I'll have to say, is Brody, Hooper, and Quint's first night, and they're talking about, they're kind of showing off their scars, and then that's when Quint tells a story about how he survived the Indianapolis sinking during World War II, and just kind of seeing the three of them, bond together after, despite their initial distrust of each other, I thought was really, really well done, and kind of a nice little bit of levity to the scene, given everything else surrounding it with all the chaos of them trying to get this shark. So. And final overall grade. This I have not. I'll be honest. Again, I've when dealing with like horror thriller films like this, I don't usually haven't watched them. So this was actually the first time I've ever seen this film, and I gotta say, over 50 years later, it still holds up really well. Obviously, if you're a beachgoer and you want to enjoy that, this is probably not the best film for you. But again, I think it got over what it needed to get over. It was a great film. It establishes Steven Spielberg. It establishes summer as a prime release time for films. And let's not forget, this film was nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards. It ended up losing to actually lost to another film I talked about, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which, I mean, that's tough competition for it. Maybe a year later or a year earlier, this film would have won, but it did end up winning Best Original Score, Best Film Editing, and Best Sound, which you can't argue with those. I mean, particularly the score and the editing, which again playing up the tension of the shark being there without you actually seeing it, But in terms of overall grade, I am going to go. It isn't quite a perfect film because I do have a few issues there, but I am going to go pretty good. I'm going to go 9 out of 10. It may be, obviously Steven Spielberg has had a lot of great films over the years after this. But like I said, this is definitely the one that put him on the map and made him a major director, and he deserves a lot of credit for delivering this kind of a film, and for, like I said, making the summer season a prime release time for films, as we'll obviously talk about throughout this week, because we got some more big films to talk about that we will talk about this week that came out in the summer and delivered big time. So, but that is going to do it for me for this episode. Thank you for listening, and thank you for continuing to support us. We got some, like I said, some more films come out this week. I know later in the month we have our Toy Story theme week, which I'm really looking forward to because that'll be on the heels of Toy Story 5 coming out. So be on the lookout for that. And of course, again, PTB Facebook group, Greatest SummerSlam Match of All Time tournament has launched. Get over there and vote if you haven't. We got some decent little matchups here in the playing round to kind of kick things off. So I want to make sure we get some good turnouts for that. So please get in there and vote if you haven't yet. But with that, I am Steve Riddle. This has been the movie review of the day here on the Pop Experience, and we'll see you next time.